Many of you have probably heard of the phrase binge watching by now, right? I think that's standard. Everyone has binge watched something probably. Now, binge watching wasn't always a thing. I mean, a lot of us remember this, right? I mean, maybe you owned a season of your favorite show on DVD, so you would then watch one episode after another. But normally, that's just not how it went. If you wanted to watch a show, you had to know when the show was supposed to be on the TV, and then you had to make sure you were able to watch it or record it. Do people remember back in the days when you used to have a VHS and you had to set it to record? I mean, we had some really good VHS movies when I was a kid. You had to fast forward the commercials. So binge watching is a new thing. Now, it started to be a thing around 2010, I think. I remember I was thinking about this. When did binge watching start to become a thing? Now, I probably experienced it before all of you. Now, do people remember when Netflix was just the place where you mailed stuff in, right? Now, we never had Netflix. My parents are upstairs. Maybe they're listening. We didn't have Netflix that way. I know Megan's dad did. But Netflix, originally, you would create a list of movies you wanted to watch, and they would send you one, or maybe up to 3, I can't remember. And then when you sent it back, they would send you the next one in your list. So that's how Netflix started. It was sort of like a mail-in DVD service. Now talk about having to wait though, because it's not even like going down to the movie theater, or not movie theater, but when we used to have it there by Kroger, there was an actual VHS rental place and then DVDs later. I used to go there and get video games. It was awesome. Now that's shoe sensation. So that used to be a DVD rental store. And also I remember Kroger used to actually have a rental place inside of them for a while. And so you'd have to go there to get your stuff if you wanted to watch it. But Netflix, it took even longer. But then Netflix had this idea, what if we put stuff on the internet and people can watch it whenever they want? And the way I experienced that first was I had a friend in college who had an Xbox 360 that can connect to the internet, and then you could connect it to your TV and you could watch something. Now, today that's just assumed. But in 2010, like most of you probably had no way to do that, right? You didn't have a way to connect your TV to the internet. So if you wanted to watch something on Netflix, you may have to use a computer. And all of a sudden, we could watch any show we wanted. And you could watch it one episode after another. And so it started with like The Office, Breaking Bad, these shows that we knew that I didn't get to watch, I could watch whenever I wanted. Well, then Netflix started to come out with their own shows. And you know what they did? They would actually give you all the episodes at once. So if you love this show, it was a new show, you could binge watch the whole season in like a day if you had enough time. So eventually Netflix actually figured out that that wasn't the best way to release their shows. Because what people were doing is they were actually just getting Netflix subscriptions to watch their show, and then they might cancel. And Netflix is like, okay, well, if we actually release one episode at a time for our most popular shows, it'll actually build more anticipation, and it'll be better for our business. So they realized that binge watching wasn't always the best way for them to share their media, and that's because of the cliffhanger. You know what I mean? That moment when the show ends and you don't know what's going to happen next. And you have to wait till next week. Now, Netflix realized that this is actually a really powerful tool. So what they do now, and a lot of the streaming services do this, they might release like a batch of like 5 episodes, half the season, and then you get to that midpoint, season 5 or episode 5, and there's a huge cliffhanger. And now you got to wait 3 months until they release the rest. Because the cliffhanger, the unanswered questions are so powerful in bringing us back and in driving conversation and creating buzz that makes their shows more popular. And network TV, this was built in. But Netflix and other streaming services had to learn that the unanswered questions of cliffhangers drove interest in their products. Now, the Bible is a story. There's a narrative. So there's natural cliffhangers. There's natural unanswered questions throughout. And Christmas both brings unanswered questions and it does answer some questions. And so what we're going to do today in Matthew 2, 1 through 12, which is our passage, if you want to turn there, is we're going to look at some of these questions that are getting answered, and we're also going to see that there's some other questions that sort of arise and get answered later. So if you want to follow along in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, we're going to be exploring the story of the Magi. So it's on page 1374. And we're going to see how some of the unanswered questions of the time of Jesus are answered later. Some of the questions of Jesus' people are answered with him. And we continue to understand what the Christmas season means. Now, to understand the Magi story, which is the story of Epiphany, we have to understand the context. And so we're going to visit two of these verses from Isaiah to sort of set the stage for us. So here's the first verse that we're going to look at. It's the first verse of chapter 60 of Isaiah. Arise, shine, your light has come. Or shine, for your light has come. And the glory of the Lord rises upon you. Now, a huge question you need to ask, and I needed to ask when I read this. Okay, who is speaking and who are they speaking to? Or to whom are they speaking? Who is the person who's getting this light shined on them? When we look at this story, Isaiah is in this moment whenever Israel is at the bottom. We've talked about Isaiah like the last 3 weeks, so this is becoming normal if you've been here to hear us talk about Isaiah. Isaiah was this moment where Israel and Judah, the two split nations of God, were sort of going down. They were trending down. They were starting to make poor decisions. And Isaiah is there to call them back to God and to warn them and to say, okay, if you do not do this, if you do not return to God, things are going to happen to you. And God's like, I can only do so much. I might have to remove my protection if you're not going to cooperate because you're not doing as I asked. And eventually Isaiah says that's going to happen. But in the background of Isaiah is this promise. And we see that promise on full display here. Shine, your light has come, the glory of the Lord rises upon you. This image of a city shining out over the nations. And so who is speaking? Well, it seems like the person speaking is this figure who is like this messianic figure, but who's speaking to God's holy city. Now, if you look at the previous chapter, it's the name Zion. Zion is just one of the many names for Jerusalem, which is really just an image for God's people. So this is what I want you to think about. Have you ever been on a cave tour? If you've been on a cave tour, this has certainly happened. Every cave tour I've ever been on, they do this. You're walking along, they're giving you the tour, and eventually they get to the spot where they stop, and they say, okay, I'm going to turn out the lights and show you how dark it is in here. And then they turn the lights off, and you can't even see your hand. They're like, put your hand in front of your face. You can't see it. That's how dark caves are. And then they always do this. They always light, usually a lighter, or maybe a match. Like if we just had this one single candle from one of these, one candle from this, and it lights up that whole cave. Because that's how much light is actually produced in darkness. And so this is the image of this passage. That even though Israel is at the bottom, they're in the pit, there's going to be a time when they're going to be shining on top of the hill like that light in a cave. And so this creates the first unanswered question. When is that going to happen for Israel? And then verse 3, there's a different one. Nations will come to your light and kings to the brightness of your dawn. So now it's not just that the light will come from Israel. It's that all of a sudden these kingdoms all around them, the kingdoms they're fighting with, the kingdoms that are trying to overthrow them, the kingdoms that are their enemies, all of a sudden these kingdoms they're going to come to Israel because of their light. Here's the second unanswered question. Okay, well, when are these nations going to come to God? Throughout the story of the Bible, it's not just a story about Israel and God. It's a story about all of humanity, every human that's ever existed in God. And the story of God wanting to bring everybody back together. And so when we read the story of Israel, we have this big question in the back of our heads. Okay, well, Israel, we know that they're important, but what about the rest of us? Well, we see right here that there's this image that God is going to somehow bring everyone back to him. And so that creates this unanswered question of when is this going to happen? And it's into this framework that Epiphany comes. Now, here is the way that Matthew tells the story. Matthew chapter 2, starting in verse 1. After Jesus was born into Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. So Matthew is the only gospel writer who tells us this story. He doesn't tell us that story that Luke tells us that we always tell on Christmas. If you're here Christmas Eve, we read it, you probably read it in your home or you've heard it read in the past. But Matthew has a different story about these Magi. So who are the Magi? Are they the kings that we sing about? Are they the wise men that we sometimes call them? What are they? Well, Magi are actually Eastern. Now for us, everything's east of us. But even east of the Middle East, think about like going towards India, further towards the Middle East. Today, like Iraq, even further that way, getting close to India. That's where these kings came from. And they, not kings, Magi. And what they were is they were astrologers. So they would look into the sky and they would try to interpret the signs, the planets moving, the stars, like we know about horoscopes, those sorts of things. That's an ancient thing. And they would look at the sky and they would try to interpret what it meant. And then kings would have these pagan astrologers. They're pagan because they had many gods. We actually think they're most likely Zoroastrians. You can look into that if you want to. But they had many gods, and they would advise kings. They would say, okay, these stars are doing this and that, and so this is what this means for you. That's who the Magi were. So why did these Magi from the east come to Jerusalem? Well, this is what Matthew tells us. So they came and they asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw a star when it rose and have come to worship him. So they saw a star in the sky that was new, and they decided they're going to come welcome this king. Now, why? It was probably some sort of diplomatic gesture. If you were an Eastern kingdom, you want to be friendly with Herod the Great. That's who Herod was. Herod the Great was the Herod. He was the OG Herod. He was the powerful one, the one that everyone was terrified of, the one that all of his later Herods, if you realize there's a bunch of Herods in the Bible, in the New Testament, there's about 6 of them, because they all want to be like this guy. But nobody was like this guy. He was feared, he was terrible, he was powerful. And so, of course, a neighboring nation is like, we're going to get in good with Herod. He had a son, we're going to send him a gift. So we know the story of the Statue of Liberty, right? In 1866, France gave us the Statue of Liberty as a gift. And we had it put up where it is now. And it was a symbol of friendship. It was a symbol of what America meant to the rest of Europe. It was a way for those two nations, for our nation and France, to come closer together to celebrate our common ideals. It's not unlike that. When these Magi come to welcome this king, there's only one problem with their gesture. Verse 3. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. All right, so he's disturbed. Now the question is, well, why? It's because he did not have a child recently. So if there is this sign in the sky that there's a new baby that's King of the Jews born, Herod's like, well, wait a minute, I didn't have a son born. Who is this king? So Herod automatically is threatened by this news. Now you might be like, why would he care what these astrologers say? It's because kings were superstitious. They listened to these things because they needed to protect themselves. They felt threatened, and their only hope was to head things off and to take every threat seriously. So Herod is in trouble, he thinks, so he has to meet with some people, and this is what he does. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them, where the Messiah was to be born. Now we learn something about Herod. He knows the stories. We talked about the Messiah recently, just a little bit ago, about the Messiah, the Isaiah figure that's supposed to come and rule. Herod knows the stories because you know what? Herod, even though he is a king placed on the throne by Caesar Augustus to rule for Rome, he is actually part Jewish. And actually, he wanted Jerusalem and Israel to see him as the Messiah. That's why he built the temple that they had. That's why he did what he did. So Herod is very threatened because this is not what he wants. He wants to know where this Messiah is supposed to be born. So this is what they tell him. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who shepherd my people Israel. So he gets this news, and he tells the Magi. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." So here it is. Herod, he wants to figure out when the Magi saw this. He's trying to gather some information, and he says, okay, look, this is where you need to go. If you find that child, tell me. I want to join you. So the Magi go. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen, when it rose, went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. So this star arises again, and this time they're able to follow it, and they know they're on the right track. And this is what happens. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And that's why we have 3. Because there was 3 gifts, so we assume maybe there was 3 Magi. There might have been a lot more. It might have been a whole caravan of people going around, traveling. This star leads the Magi to the young Jesus. They present him with gifts, and they pay homage. I don't even know the right word to use. We don't do this. But the people do this before royalty. They bow, they acknowledge their, fake superiority. I mean, we're Americans. We don't have kings for a reason because we realize all people are equal. But for a long time, royalty was placed at a place above everyone else. And in certain times, that's because the kings claimed to be sons of God and no one else was. So they were actually special. And so people treated them like gods in some sense. And so these Magi are being reverent before this young child. They're treating him as a king. They're bringing him gifts. Now, the word worship doesn't have to mean like how we think of worship. It could just be paying respect. It seems for sure that they thought he was a king. There's no reason to think that they thought he was actually the Son of God, like we have come to know him. They are simply acknowledging him as a legitimate heir to the throne of Israel. This child that was born in this little town outside of Jerusalem, in this small home with a poor family, he is the new king. And so this is what happens in verse 12. So they had seen Jesus, and having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. And so they're told to go somewhere else because Herod's true colors are shown. And here's what we see in this Magi story. They offer gifts and honor to Jesus as a foreign king. So we have people from outside of Jerusalem coming to acknowledge their future king. And what we see is Herod, who's supposed to be a king who's welcoming this new Messiah, acting like the Magi should, viewing him as a threat, trying to eliminate him. So we have the Magi and the actual Jewish leaders and everything's swapped. Everything's mixed upside down. It's sort of like, I don't know if anyone this year watched the Jim Carrey Grinch movie. My kids, for the first time, got to watch that one this year. That movie really helps us reimagine the Grinch story, right? Because they give us a whole Grinch backstory. Maybe that's why you don't like it. All of a sudden, we realize why the Grinch is the Grinch. He was different. He was not always well-liked because he was different. But he actually seemed to understand Christmas better than the Who's. He saw through their fake. There's that one line where he calls it avarice. I still remember that line. I don't know if Jim Carrey, that was scripted or if that was him ad-libbing, but it's the most powerful line in the whole movie. When he looks at all the Who's and he talks about the avarice, one of the 7 deadly sins. The fact that they care and they're so greedy that they care more about giving gifts and spending money at Christmas and outdoing one another and out decorating their houses than what it's truly about in the Grinch world, which is about family and love and coming together and celebrating something. So in Jim Carrey's Grinch, it's almost as if the Grinch is actually not the Grinch, but he becomes the Grinch because of the fact that the Who's don't understand Christmas. Well, that's sort of what's going on here. The people who should get it don't get it, and the people who we don't think get it do get it, and that's the Magi. And they come to visit Jesus. This is the moment where Jesus isn't just the king for the Jewish people, but he's the king for the whole world. And what this does is it actually hints to something that's coming later. And now this is where we have what Paul says. Now we're not reading all what Paul says, just a couple verses. So we can really grasp this. So this is what Paul says here again to the Ephesians. For this reason, I, Paul, the prisoner of Christ Jesus, for the sake of the Gentiles, surely you have heard about the admission of God's grace that is given to me for you, that is, the mystery made known to me by revelation, as I've already written it, briefly. Again, when we read Paul, it's really easy to just get lost. He's wordy, he uses weird phrases. Here's what he's getting at. There's this mystery, and the mystery is this. Paul is actually taking the message of Jesus to the Gentiles. Now, the word Gentile is an English version of a Greek word. Guess what that word actually means? The nations. I don't know why we use the word Gentile. It's not a real word. Gentile just meant nations. It meant the same thing that the Old Testament talks about the nations, the kings, everybody who's not Jewish. Paul is now the one who goes to those people with this mystery. Now, what is the mystery? He says it in verse 6. This mystery, okay, so if anyone's ever tried to tell you that they tried to come up with some strange mystery for Paul, just show them in verse 6 that he just tells us what it is. This mystery is that through the gospel, the Gentiles are heirs together with Israel, members together of one body, and shares together in the promise in Christ Jesus. If you were here last week, we talked about how Jesus came to make us family. Again, we see this week Paul talking about how we are now part of the family of God because of Jesus. So what we see is the Tower of Babel story undone. Now, if you want to hear about that, you got to stick with us until we get to Pentecost. But we see right now the foundations of that being laid because the Magi have come. The Magi visit tips the scales back towards harmony. Remember, the world is in chaos because of human rebellion. So God wants to call the nation to bless the nations, to bring the harmony back. But the nations and Israel, they fight, and then Israel fights, and no one listens to God. But there's all this hope that one day it'll be set right. And the Magi visit tips the scales back towards harmony. Think about the Civil War. We were a union, and then we weren't a union, until we were a union again. Something had to happen to bring us back together. Something has to happen to bring back together the nations. And that's the birth of Jesus. The Magi visit tips the scales back towards harmony. The Magi just says, hey, something's going on with this baby. Something special. The nations are noticing him now. It's not just Israel anymore. And this is what Epiphany is about. It's an important piece of our story because it solves this unanswered question of how is the nations going to see us and see Israel and come back to God. This is how God is going to bring unity with Jesus. And the Magi visit tips the scales back towards harmony. So why do the Magi visit Jesus? Because God revealed to them an important piece of his story in a way that they could understand through the stars. That way he could bring the nations back to him. And the Magi, they come and they welcome this baby and they receive him in a way that the Jews do not. And all of this points towards what Jesus is going to be. The Magi visit tips the scales back towards harmony. The Old Testament is full of prophecies about God restoring the world, saving the nations, bringing harmony back to creation. And Epiphany is the moment when the world is put on notice that harmony is coming. Now we should be on notice as the story of Jesus unfolds. We live in the benefit of the Magi coming to Jesus. And Jesus opening a way for us to be part of his people. That's what Paul was talking about. Through his grace, we receive the gift of the heir of being part of Jesus' kingdom. But part of that is being called to do his work. The work of helping build harmony today. That's part of our work. Because the Magi have seen Jesus, we get to call people back to God and say that Jesus is supposed to be your king too. And guess what? He's actually going to bring harmony. He's going to bring peace. He's going to bring hope in life. So may we follow in the footsteps of the Magi. May we come to our King, because the Magi visit tips the scales back towards harmony.